Welcome back to Major Antonio's presentation of The Story of the Indian Mutiny by Ascott R. Chapter 3, The Spread of Insurrection.
The sepoys have come in from Meerut and are burning everything. "We must shut up," had been the last message flashed from Delhi by a young clerk, who was killed in the act of sending it. This news, kept secret for a few hours by the authorities, was soon startling the English stations, north and west, and was put out of doubt by reports of the fugitives as they came to spread their dismay from various points. On this side, fortunately, reigned the energy and foresight which had so disastrously failed at Meerut. Lahore, the capital of the Punjab, swarmed with fierce fanatics who would willingly have emulated the deeds of their brethren at Meerut and Delhi. In the cantonments, a few miles off, were 4 regiments of sepoys, held in check only by a small force of Europeans. But here Mr. Montgomery, the commissioner in charge, showed a prompt mastery of the situation. He at once assembled a council of the chief civil and military officers, and not without doubt on the part of some of his advisers, resolved to disarm the dangerous regiments before they should be excited to the revolt they were already conspiring. Next day, May 12th, a ball was to be given at the cantonments. Lest the sepoys should take warning, it went on as if nothing were the matter, but many of the dancers must have been in no festive mood at a scene to recall that famous revelry on the night before Quatre Bras. The officers had their arms at hand in the ballroom. Dancing was kept up till 2 in the morning. Then, at early dawn, the whole brigade was turned out on the parade ground. The native regiments were suddenly ordered to pile arms. They hesitated in obeying, but the thin line of English soldiers confronting them fell back to reveal 12 guns, loaded with grape, behind which the infantry ramrods rang fear into their doubtful hearts. Sullenly they gave up their arms. 2,500 sepoys cowed before not 1/4 their number. At the same time, the fort in the city was made safe by the disarming of its native garrison. Piquets of Europeans were posted at various points, and arrangements made for defense against any sudden rising. Similar bold and prompt measures to secure other stations, forts, and arsenals of the Punjab at once checked the spread of the mutiny in this direction, and afforded a base of operations for its suppression. But, on other sides, it ran through the country like wildfire, here blazing up into sudden revolt, there smoldering for weeks before it gathered head, at one place crackling out almost as soon as kindled, at another resolutely trampled down by vigilant authority. Elsewhere, quickly growing to a conflagration that swept over the richest provinces of India, unchaining the fiercest passions of its mixed population, and destroying for a time all landmarks of law and order. Men had to show, then, of what stuff they were made. While some of our countrymen gave way before the danger, or even precipitated it through panic or indecision, others stood fast at their posts, and by proud audacity were able to hold the wavering natives to allegiance, and still to keep hundreds of thousands overawed before the name of English rule. Not seldom was it seen how mere boldness proved the best policy in dealing with a race tamed by centuries of bondage, yet, in too many cases, gallantry, honor, devotion to duty fell sacrificed under the rage of maddened rebels. It is impossible here to track the irregular progress of the revolt, or to dwell on its countless episodes of heroism and suffering. Pitiable was the lot of all English people in the disturbed districts, most pitiable that of officials who, obliged to expose their own lives from hour to hour, had to fear for wife and child a fate worse than death. At their isolated posts, they heard daily rumors of fresh risings, treasons, massacres, and knew not how soon the same perils might burst upon themselves and their families. For weeks, sometimes, they had to wait in sickening suspense, a handful of whites among crowds of dusky faces, scowling on them more threateningly from day to day, with no guard but men who would be the first to turn their arms upon those whose safety was entrusted to them. To many, it must have been a relief when the outbreak came, and they saw clearly how to deal with false friends and open foes. Then, at a season of the Indian year when activity and exposure are hurtful to the health of Europeans, for whom life, through that sweltering heat, seems made only tolerable by elaborate contrivances and the services of obsequious attendants, These sorely tried people had to fight for their lives, pent up in some improvised stronghold, wanting perhaps ammunition or food, or, worst torment in such a climate, water, till relief came, often only in the form of death. Or again, it might be their chance to fly, sun-scorched, destitute, desperate, skulking like thieves and beggars among a population risen in arms against the power and the creed they represented. It should never be forgotten how certain natives indeed showed kindness and pity towards their fallen masters. We have seen that in some cases the mutinous sepoys let their officers go unhurt. Occasionally they risked their own lives to protect English women and children against the fury of their comrades. But one horrible atrocity after another warned the masterful race how little they had now to hope from the love or fear of those from whom they had exacted such flattering servility in quiet times. Among the natives themselves, the excesses of the mutiny were hardly less calamitous. Many, if not most, were hurried into it by panic or excitement, or the persuasion of the more designing, and their hearts soon misgave them when they saw the fruit of their wild deeds, still more when they considered the punishment likely to follow. Anarchy, as usual, sprang up behind rebellion. Debtors fell upon their creditors, neighbors fought with neighbors, old feuds were revived, fanaticism and crime ran rampant over the ruins of British justice. Towns were sacked, jails broken open, treasuries plundered. Broken bands of sepoys and released convicts roamed about the country, murdering and pillaging unchecked. Tribes of hereditary robbers eagerly returned to their old ways, now that our police need no longer be feared. The native police, themselves recruited from the dangerous classes, were frequently the first to set an example of rebellion. Not a few native officials, it should be said, gave honorable proofs of their fidelity through all risks, while the mass of them behaved like hirelings or displayed their inward hostility. The more thoughtful part of the population might well hesitate on which side to declare. Some prudently did their best to stand well with both, in case of any event, but those who had much to lose must soon have regretted the firm rule of our government. On the whole, it may be said that the princes and nobles, where not carried away by ambition or religious zeal, remained more or less loyal to our cause, having better means than the ignorant mob of judging that our power would yet right itself, though crippled by such a sudden storm and staggering like to founder in so troubled waters. But in Oud and other recently annexed districts, where the zemindars and talukdars, or chief landowners, had often been treated with real harshness in the settlement of revenue, this class naturally proved hostile, yet not more so than the poor peasants, to whom our rule had rather been a benefit. The latter, indeed, acted in great part less like determined rebels than like foolish schoolboys, who, finding themselves all at once rid of a strict pedagogue, had seized the opportunity for a holiday spell of disorder. As with the sepoys themselves, defection sometimes seemed a matter of childish impulse, and there would come a moment of infectious excitement, in which the least breath of chance turned them into staunch friends or ruthless foes. Except in Oud, it may be said, the movement was in general a military mutiny rather than a popular insurrection, while everywhere, of course, the bad characters of the locality took so favorable an occasion for violence. To gain some clear idea of what was going on over a region that would make a large country in Europe, it seems best to take one narrative as a good example of many. This means somewhat neglecting the rules of proportion required in a regular historical narrative. It will also lead to an overlapping of chapters in the order of time. In any case, it must be difficult to arrange orderly the multifarious and entangled episodes of this story, and the plan of our book rather is to present its characteristic outlines in scenes which cannot always be shifted to mark the exact succession of events, but which will roughly exhibit the main stages of the struggle. Let us, then, dismount from the high horse of history to follow a representative tale of personal adventures by Mr. W. Edwards, magistrate and collector at Budaun in Rohilkhand, the district lying on the Ganges between Delhi and Oud. Almost at once after the outbreak at Meerut, his country began to show signs of epidemic lawlessness. Just in time, Mr. Edwards sent his wife and child off to the hill station of Naini Tal. Then it was 10 weeks before he could hear of their safety. A British officer, of course, had nothing for it but to stick to his post, all the more closely now that it was one of danger. The danger soon began to be apparent. What news did reach him was of robbers springing up all round, sepoys in mutiny, convicts being let loose, and amid this growing disorder, he stood the ruler of more than 1,000,000 men, with no force to back him but doubtfully loyal natives, and no European officials nearer than Bareilly, the headquarters of the district, 30 miles off. His best friend was a Sikh servant named Wazir Singh, a native Christian, who was to show rare fidelity throughout the most trying circumstances. At the end of the month, he had the satisfaction of a visit from one of his colleagues, and good news of a small sepoy force under an English officer on its way to help him. But this gleam of hope was soon extinguished. For the last time, on Sunday, May 31st, he assembled at his house a little congregation with whom he was accustomed to hold Christian services. In the middle of the night, a sowar came galloping as for his life to report that Bareilly was up, that the sepoys there were in full mutiny, and the roads covered by thousands of scoundrels released from the jail. His brother magistrate at once dashed off to his own post. Mr. Edwards thought it his duty to remain to the last, like the captain of a sinking ship. In the forenoon, a few white men and Eurasians gathered at his house for poor protection. He wished them to disperse, believing that each could better escape separately, while their sticking together would only attract attention. But the others seemed too much overcome by fear to act for themselves, and refused to leave him. The stifling day wore on in anxious rumors. In the afternoon, the native officer in charge of the treasury came to ask Edwards to join the guard there, assuring him with solemn oaths that the men meant to be faithful. He was about to start when Wazir Singh earnestly entreated him not to trust them. He took the advice, and afterwards learned that these men had been waiting to murder him. They would not come to his house for fear the plundering of the treasury might begin in their absence. About 6 p.m., the mutineers from Bareilly arrived, and tumultuous shouts announced that sepoys, police, prisoners, and all had broken loose at Budaun. Now the magistrate might think of himself, all show of authority being gone. He mounted his wife's horse, that had been standing saddled all day, and rode off, accompanied by 2 European indigo planters and a customs officer. His Eurasian clerk and his family he was obliged to leave, as they had no means of conveyance but a buggy, and the roads were blocked. All he could do for them was to consign them to the care of an influential native who happened to come up, and as luckily these people were almost as dark as Hindus, they succeeded in hiding themselves, at all events for a time. Mr. Edwards had not ridden far when he met a Mohammedan sheikh who proposed to him to take refuge at his house some 3 miles in another direction. He turned with this well-wisher, then, passing his own bungalow again, saw how in 10 minutes the plundering of it had already begun, his servants being first at the work. Wazir Singh and another faithful follower accompanied him, carrying 150 rupees in their waistbands. That was all he had in the world, but his watch, revolver, a little testament, and a purse which had just arrived from England as a birthday present, which he kept about him as a dear gift rather than for use. Such a man in the East is not used to carrying money, but trusts his servants to act as purse-bearers, who will not cheat him more than is the custom. A groom had been entrusted with a change of clothes, but he soon disappeared. When the party reached the house where they had been promised shelter, one of the family came out, respectfully informing their leader that they would not be safe here, but they must go on to a village about 18 miles off. Mr. Edwards was much annoyed at this inhospitable reception, which afterwards turned out a blessing in disguise, for presently a band of horsemen arrived in search of him, and he would probably have been murdered, if he had not now been on the way to that further refuge. Till midnight, the fugitives rode through byways and fields, and villages swarming with armed crowds, who let the Englishmen pass in silence under the convoy of their chief. He took them to a house of his in a small village, where, after thanking heaven for their escape, they lay down to rest on the flat roof. The magistrate, for one, weary and worn out as he was, could hardly close an eye after the excitement of such a day. Early in the morning, they were roused up by the sheikh, who told them they must cross the Ganges at once, as their enemies would soon be in pursuit. So they did, fired at by an excited crowd assembled for the plunder of a neighboring village, whose bullets luckily did not come near them. On the other side, they were received by a Mohammedan gentleman who was the more civil to them, as he heard that 2 English officials with a large body of horse were in the neighborhood to restore order. Edwards and his party joined their countrymen, but found that the main body of expected troops had mutinied and made for Delhi, while their escort of 60 sowars was in such a doubtful disposition that they were glad to send most of them off on pretense of guarding a treasury, which these men at once plundered and dispersed. With 20 troopers, whose fidelity they had to trust, the Englishmen started for Agra, but soon turned back, the road being blocked by mutineers marching to Delhi. They hardly knew which way to take. A party of 200 sepoys was reported to be hunting them out. Their escort grew so insolent that they thought best to dismiss these fellows to go where they pleased. Then, for a moment, it seemed as if the troopers were about to fall on them, but after a short consultation, turned and rode off. The Englishmen, having been 20 hours on horseback, came back to the village from which they had started. But they could not be safe here, and after a day's halt, determined to separate. The other 2 civilians made a fresh attempt to push on for Agra. Edwards would not desert his companions, encumbrance as they were to him, for local chiefs, who might be willing to shelter government officers at some risk, in the hope of getting credit for it on the re-establishment of our power, were unwilling to extend their services to these private persons. He had received a message asking him to come back to Budan, as the mutineers had left it, and things were comparatively quiet there. He afterwards understood this to be a snare, the sepoys being much exasperated against him because less money had been found in the treasury than they expected. But now he decided to return with the 3 who shared his fortunes. They had first to cross the Ganges. On regaining the house of a zamindar, who had been a friendly enough host 2 days before, they met with a colder reception, for meanwhile this native gentleman had heard the worst news of the spread of mutiny. He agreed to provide them with a boat, but it proved too small to carry their horses across. All they could get out of the zemindar was an evident desire to be rid of them, and he strongly recommended them to make for Farrukhabad, 60 miles off, where, he said, no mutiny had taken place. Hearing that the other side of the Ganges was all ablaze with pillage and destruction, they saw nothing for it but to follow this advice. They set out, then, by night, and passed by several villages without being molested. At daybreak, they reached a large place where they presented themselves to the chief proprietor, who was polite but would hardly let them into his house, while a brother of his, drunk with opium, seemed disposed to shoot them on the spot. The chief did relax so far as to give them some breakfast, then packed them off under escort of 5 horsemen to the care of a neighbor. Before leaving, he insisted on having a certificate that he had treated them well, a suspicious sign, and Wazir Singh overheard the escort saying that they were all to be killed. Putting a good face on the chance of having to fight for their lives, they reached a riverside village where they were promised a boat to take them to Futugur, the English station near Farrukhabad. But instead of a boat, about the house in which they waited for it, a crowd of armed men appeared, with such menacing looks that the Englishmen mounted and rode off, to find their way barred by a body of horse. They turned back. Then the crowd began to fire, and their escort at once galloped away. So did the Englishmen, but one of them, who rode a camel, fell into the hands of the mob and was cut to pieces. The other 3 cleared away for themselves and rejoined their escort, who looked rather ill-pleased that they had escaped. Their leader, however, had shown some traces of pity, and now on Edwards appealing to him as a husband and a father, he undertook to save their lives if he could, and conducted them back to his master, who seemed sorry for what had happened, but would not keep them in the house beyond nightfall. Disguised in native dress, their own clothes being burned to conceal all trace of their visit, they set forth again under the charge of 2 guides, and this time were more fortunate. Riding all night, once chased for their lives, at daybreak they reached the house of Mr. Probyn, collector of Farrukhabad, from whom they had a hearty welcome, but little cheering news. The sepoys at Futtehgir had broken out, then had been brought back to their duty for a time, but could not be depended on. A large number of the Europeans had gone down the Ganges in boats to Cawnpore. Others, among them Probyn's wife and children, were sheltered in a fort across the river, belonging to a zamindar named Hurdeo Buksh. Edwards was foregoing to Cawnpore, but that very day came the news of the rising there. After consultation with the officers at Futtehgir, he agreed to accompany Probyn to Hurdeo Buksh's fort, where he found a number of acquaintances and colleagues living in great discomfort and without much show of protection in the dilapidated defenses of this native stronghold. Uncertainty and doubt reigned among these unfortunate people also. As the colonel of the Sepoy regiment at the station persisted in believing it staunch, and as some hopeful news from Delhi seemed calculated to keep it so, after 2 or 3 days, most of the refugees returned to Futtehgir. Probyn, however, preferred to trust his native friend, and Edwards, though the others judged him rash, decided to stay with Hurdeo Buksh. Here he was now joined by the faithful Wazir Singh, who had been separated from him in that riot on the river bank, but had lost no time in seeking his master out with the money entrusted to him. When 2 days more had passed, a band of mutineers arrived from another station, flushed with massacre, and this was the signal for the Futtehgir regiment to rise. The Europeans had taken refuge in the fort there. Outside its walls, all was uproar, villagers and sepoys fighting for the plunder. Hurdeo Buksh at once assembled his feudal retainers, 1,000 in number, and dug out from various hiding places the guns which he had concealed on the English government, ordering these petty chiefs to give up all their ordnance. He explained to his guests that a body of mutineers was coming to attack the fort, led by a false report that the 2 collectors had several lakhs of treasure with them. They must at once go into hiding in an out-of-the-way village, as he could not trust his followers to fight for them. The Englishmen were unwilling to leave even such doubtful shelter as the fort offered, but when this Rajput chief gave them his right hand, pledging his honor for their safety, as far as in him lay, they knew he might be trusted and consented to go. Carrying their bedding, arms, and the Probyn's 4 little children, they crossed the Ramgunga and reached the place where their quarters were to be, a filthy enclosure from which the cattle and goats were cleared out to make room for them. There at least they remained undisturbed, but after a few days were startled by sounds of heavy firing from Futtehgir, where the Europeans were now being besieged in the fort. Contradictory rumors kept Probyn and Edwards in painful suspense, and when trustworthy news did come, it was not assuring. The little force in the fort, some 30 fighting men with twice that tale of women and children, could not hold out much longer. But several days and nights passed, and still the cannonading went on incessantly. On the morning of the 5th day, there was a sudden silence, which might mean that the attack had been given up or that the resistance had been overpowered. Some hours later came fresh sounds of quick and irregular firing from another quarter, further down the river. While our miserable refugees were asking themselves what this portended, a messenger from Hurdeo Buksh came to tell them that the English had during the night evacuated the fort and fled in boats, only to be discovered and pursued, so the shots they now heard must be the death knells of their wretched countrymen. Still, however, came conflicting stories. At one time, the boats were said to be out of range, then to have sunk. The firing ceased, to break out again for an hour towards evening. At last they heard that one boat had escaped to Cawnpore, but that another had grounded, most of the people on board being massacred or drowned. It would take too long to trace all the further perils of Edwards and the Probyns, who for weeks to come remained hidden in a cowhouse for the most part, owing their safety chiefly to the heavy rains, that after a time turned their place of refuge into an island. Their presence here had been betrayed, and the Nawab of Farrukhabad kept pressing Hurdeo Buksh to give them up. But on the whole, he proved a staunch protector, though more than once he seemed ready to get rid of so compromising guests. At one time, he had started them off by boat for Cawnpore, to certain death, as they believed. At another, they were to fly to Lucknow, disguised as natives, but that plan was frustrated by bad news of how things were going there. Then again, there was a design of smuggling them off to the hills, and once it was even proposed that they should abandon the children and take to the jungle. They were glad to be allowed to remain in their wretched shelter, where sometimes they durst not show themselves, or the rain kept them close prisoners. Poor Mrs. Probyn's baby wasted away for want of proper nourishment. When it died, they had to bury it in the darkness, thankful to find a dry spot on which to dig a grave. Another of the children had the same miserable fate. The whole party grew thin and weak on their poor native fare. 2 books they had, which were a great comfort to them, a Bible and a copy of Bridges on Psalm 6. On the flyleaf of the latter, Edwards wrote a note to his wife at Naini Tal and had the joy of hearing from her that she and his child were safe. The natives who carried these communications did so at the risk of their lives, but the severity used to anyone caught acting as messenger for the English did not prevent more than one letter from reaching the refugees. Their native neighbors, on the whole, were kind, at least not showing any hatred towards them. By and by, both Herdeo Buksh and his dependents began to exhibit more active friendship, a sign of the advance of the English troops to reconquer the districts deluged by rebellion. Finally, at the end of August, their miserable condition was relieved by a message from General Havelock, who had now reached Cawnpore. Thither they set out, running the gauntlet of fresh dangers on the river, and could hardly believe their good fortune when at length they found themselves safe among British bayonets. The whole story is a most moving one, and should be read in full in Mr. Edwards' book, to the interest of which this abridgment by no means does justice, since its object is rather to show the state of the country than to enlarge on individual adventures and sufferings. One passage in his party's obscure experiences brings us back to the highway of history. More than a month after the fall of Fudagur, there had appeared at their refuge a tall, lean, spectral-looking figure, almost naked and dripping with water, in whom Edwards with difficulty recognized a young Mr. Jones, heard of by them as having escaped from the boats to another of Herdeo Buksh's villages. There he had been hiding ever since, and now, in his weak state, burst into tears at the sight of a countryman again and the sound of an English voice. From him they learned with horror all the particulars of the massacre that had been enacted within their hearing. The little garrison of the Fudagur citadel had defended themselves till their ammunition was almost exhausted, as well as their strength, while the sepoys had begun to blow down their walls by the explosion of mines. Hampered by women and children, their only way of escape was the Ganges that flowed by this fort. Early in the morning of July 3rd, they embarked in 3 boats to drop down the river. But their flight was soon discovered, and daylight showed them pursued by the bloodthirsty sepoys. The swift current of the Ganges helped them so well that they might have got off safe but for the shallows that obstruct its channel. One of the boats soon grounded, and its people had to be transferred to another under fire. This second boat, in turn, on which Jones now was, stuck fast on another sandbank opposite a village, the inhabitants of which turned out against it with matchlocks, and 2 guns opened fire from the bank. As the men were repelling this attack and trying in vain to move off their heavy ark, there drifted down upon them a boat full of sepoys, who, after pouring in a deadly volley, boarded the helpless craft. Most of its passengers, not already killed or wounded, jumped overboard. What followed, as related by Jones to Edwards, makes a too true picture of that terrible time. The water was up to their waists, and the current running very strong. The bottom was shifting sand, which made it most difficult to maintain a footing, and several of those who took to the river were at once swept off and drowned. Jones himself had scarcely got into the water when he was hit by a musket ball, which grazed the right shoulder without damaging the bone. At the same moment, he saw Major Robertson, who was standing in the stream supporting his wife with one arm and carrying his little child in the other, wounded by a musket ball in the thigh. Mrs. Robertson was washed out of her husband's grasp and immediately drowned. Robertson then put the child on his shoulder and swam away down the stream. Jones, finding that he could do no more good, wounded as he was, determined to try to save his own life by swimming down the river, hoping to reach the leading boat. As he struck out from the boat, he saw poor Mr. Fisher, the chaplain, almost in the same position as Robertson, holding his little son, a beautiful boy 8 or 9 years old, in one arm, while with the other he supported his wife. Mrs. Fisher was swaying about in the stream almost insensible, and her husband could with great difficulty retain his footing. When Jones had got clear of the boat, he continued alternately swimming and floating for 5 or 6 miles, when just as it was growing dusk, he saw the leading boat anchored for the night. He reached it, much exhausted by swimming and by the pain of his wound and of his back, which, as he was naked to the waist, had been blistered and made raw by the scorching sun. On being taken on board, he found that the only casualty which had occurred to this party since leaving Futtehgor was the death of one of the Miss Goldies, who had been killed by a grape shot from one of the guns on the bank near Singarampur. Mrs. Lois, who had maintained her fortitude throughout and was indefatigable during the siege in preparing tea and refreshment for the men, immediately got him some brandy and water and food, and he was then able to acquaint them with the miserable fate of his own party, of whom he supposed himself to be the sole survivor. The boat remained anchored in the same spot all night. Towards morning, a voice was heard from the bank, hailing the boat. It proved to be that of Mr. Fisher, who, though badly wounded in the thigh, had managed by swimming a portion of the way, then landing and walking along the bank, to overtake the boat. He was helped on board more dead than alive, and raved about his poor wife and son, both of whom were drowned. At dawn, they weighed anchor and proceeded down the stream, but very slowly, as there was no pilot or skillful steersman on board, and only the exhausted officers as rowers. Towards evening, they became so exhausted that they made for a village on the Oud side of the Ganges, in hopes of being able to procure some milk for the children and food for themselves. The villagers brought supplies and did not show any ill will or attempt to attack the party. The boat was so crowded with its freight of from 70 to 80 human beings that Jones could find no space to lie down and sleep. He therefore determined, as he was quite exhausted, to go on shore and endeavor to get some rest. A villager brought him a charpoy, on which he lay down and fell fast asleep. He was roused by a summons from Colonel Smith to rejoin the boat, as they were on the point of starting. But finding himself very stiff and scarcely able to move, he determined to remain where he was, as he thought he might as well die on shore as in the boat. In either case, he regarded death as inevitable. He therefore sent back a message that he could not come and begged to be left behind. Colonel Smith, after this, sent him 2 more urgent requests to join the boat, which at length departed without him. He slept till morning, when a poor Brahmin took pity on him and permitted him to remain in a little shed where he was partially sheltered from the sun. There he remained unmolested by the villagers and protected by the Brahmin until he was permitted to join us. In the absence of other surgery, Jones had a happy thought for treating his wound, which else might have killed him by mortification. He got a little puppy to lick it morning and evening, then it at once began to improve. But he was still in a sorry state when, wading and swimming all night over the inundated country, he managed to join Edward's party. 2 of his companions, who had also escaped alive, were hidden in other villages without being able to communicate with each other. 3 unhappy ladies and a child had been taken back captive to Futtehgor. There, 3 weeks later, by order of the Nawab, who played the tyrant here for a time, they were blown away from guns or shot down by grape, along with some scores of native Christians, on whom the sepoys thus wreaked the infuriation of their defeat by Havelock's troops. The first boat's crew had gained Cawnpore, only to be involved in its still more awful tragedy. Before coming to that part of the story, let us turn from the provinces now deluged by rebellion to see what was being done elsewhere to make head against such a torrent.
This concludes today's reading of the story of the Indian Mutiny, by Ascott R. Join us also the day after tomorrow for the subsequent chapter, or download the entire audiobook from our webshop at antonio.net. Thank you for listening, and so long.